Amen. Last Sunday, I tried to preach on the subject of courage or encouragement and discouragement. And I will say, I don't know if y'all thought I was discouraged, but I got a lot of good response from that message, and I appreciate the encouragement. But, it seemed like I even heard from people online who had listened to it that did seem to resonate with people. And that's probably because even as good as we have it in this world, it is a world of discouragement. It's a valley of tears and frustrations and death, and as well as we have it today, our lives are full of heartbreak and sadness. And so I hope that we can be encouragers to one another. We looked at 2 Timothy chapter 1 last week, where Paul expressed his affection for Timothy. He expressed that he saw something good in Timothy, and then he expressed he shared the gospel with Timothy once again to encourage him. But the thought on my mind this morning is, where do we go when there's not a Paul in our life? Where do we go when there's no one else, it seems, that will build us up or encourage us? How can we still find courage? Thankfully, everybody here is in somewhat, even if you're not a baptized member of this church, you're a part of this faith family, right? And so you should have people, hopefully, that can encourage you. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. But a lot of times we find ourselves in situations where it seems like there's no one to encourage us or to build us up. It may be, not that it's a lack of effort on others' parts, but a lot of times there are things that go on in our lives that we just either don't want anyone else to know about, or just don't feel comfortable sharing with others, and it can become very discouraging in our lives, right? Maybe that's not a good thing, to have those things that you don't feel comfortable sharing with others, but the fact is, it's the truth. Whether we're uncomfortable about it or we don't want to, we don't want to ruin our image about some things, right? There are things that we have in our lives that are discouraging to us. And whether anybody in your family, your friends, your church members know about it, there's one, your enemy, Satan, that'll find out about it. He'll use it. And you may feel alone. Anybody else felt like that? I've felt alone before, that I'm dealing with things that nobody knows about and or nobody cares about. But how can we find courage on our own? And I think to look at that this morning, we'll look at some profiles of courageous men who found themselves in situations where everyone around them was only adding to their discouragement. No one was being an encourager to them. And if we can look at what they did and what they focused on in their times of discouragement, I believe we can learn what we can focus on to be encouraged ourselves. And so we'll begin in 1 Samuel chapter 30. And in 1 Samuel chapter 30, David has been with the Philistines, and the Philistines are about to fight Israel, and the Philistine commanders find out that David's mighty men, David's men are with them, and so they send David away. They say, David could rise up and fight against us, so let's just send David home. And it says in verse 11 of 1 Samuel chapter 29, it says, "And David and his men rose up early to depart in the morning to return to the land of the Philistines. And the Philistines went up to Jezreel." They go up to fight. David had found himself in a sticky situation. Any of y'all ever find yourself of your own doing in a sticky situation? You don't know how to get out of it? Well, the Lord just handled that for David, didn't he? He said, the Philistines said, you need to rise up early in the morning and just get back to your home. And so David does it. And David and his men must have felt some relief. And they get up early and they go back to their home. And in verse 1 of chapter 30, 1 Samuel, it says, "And it came to pass, when David and his men were come to Ziklag on the third day, that the Amalekites had invaded the south and Ziklag, and smitten Ziklag, and burned it with fire, and had taken the women captives that were therein. They slew not any, either great or small, but carried them away, and went on their way." And so David and his men, they got up early in the morning. It's about I believe it's 50 miles, about a 3-day journey back to their home. And so by this time, they're tired, they're worn out. And as they begin to come back to their home, it's in sight now. They can see the smoke Maybe they can see the flames. You ever been so worn out in life that maybe the refrigerator's gone out, and about the time you get that fixed, the dryer goes out. About the time you get that fixed, the internet goes down, and you just see the smoke continues to roll, right? And they're tired and they're worn out and they want some rest, but now they're coming back to their house, and they can tell something has happened. It says in verse 3, so David and his men came to the city, and behold, it was burned with fire, and their wives and their sons and their daughters were taken captive. So David and his men have made this trek back to their home, only to find that their homes, everything they have, has been burnt, has been taken away, not only their possessions, but their very spouses, their wives, their daughters, their sons have been taken and kidnapped by the enemy. Then David and the people that were with him lifted up their voice and wept. Listen to this, what it says, until they had no more power to weep. You ever been in a situation where you've wept so much that you have no more power to weep? Some of y'all are shaking your head that you have. This is real heartbreak, isn't it? This is a real discouraging time for David and his men. But let's focus on what David did, because it says that David and his two wives were taken captive. It's Ahinoam and Abigail, the wife of Nabal the Carmelite, it says. In verse 6, it says, and David was greatly distressed. He's cried all the tears he can possibly cry, and he's still greatly distressed. And so if there was ever a time that a man needed his church family, that a man needed his brothers and sisters, this would have been it. And he looks to those who can encourage him, and it says, for the people spake of stoning him. Because the soul of the people was grieved, every man for his sons and for his daughters. So when David finds himself in this situation, the mighty men that David had been fighting with, that he'd been doing life with, that had been following him, they all turn against him. And you probably can't blame them in some ways. They've been following his leadership. They left no one here to guard their home. Now their wives, their sons, their daughters are gone. Everything's been burnt. Their possessions have been stolen. And so they say, you know what? The best thing we can do is just stone David and find somebody else. And this is a discouraging time. But after that, it says, but David encouraged himself in the Lord his God. So the question was, how can we encourage ourselves when there's no one around to encourage us? Well, here's a situation we can look at, that the mighty man David, when he was in a situation where there was no one to encourage him, but it says, but David encouraged himself in the Lord his God. You know what the word encourage himself, you go look at, what does that word mean? It's to fasten to seize, to draw strength from something. What David did in his moment of his lowest moment, in his weakness, in his confusion, in his sadness, in his distress, in his discouragement, he says he latched on to the one thing that he could draw courage from. Remember when Paul told Timothy, he said, be strong in the grace that is in Christ Jesus? That we're to draw our strength, that he is our strength. He is a very present help in time of trouble, with Psalm 46. That's what David is living here. David, at his weakest point, he latches on to the one thing that's consistent in all of our lives. Your bank account will go up, it'll go down. Your friends will be friendly sometimes and they won't at other times. Your church will be on highs and it'll be on lows. But the one thing that always remains the same is the Lord. And so he encouraged himself. He fastens himself to the Lord. And then he begins to inquire of the Lord. And he says, shall I pursue after the troop? Should I overtake them? And the Lord answers him. He says, pursue, for thou wilt surely overtake them. Without fail, you shall recover all. If you go on to read the rest of this chapter, you'll see that David not only recovered everything that he had left, but he gets more on top of that, because we serve a good God, right? Do y'all agree with that this morning? Are y'all with me this morning? So David, here in this situation, David encourages himself in the Lord. Now, how are we going to latch on? You say, Brother Josh, I understand those words. We need to trust in the Lord with all our heart. We need to not lean on our understanding. We need to lean on God, to latch on to God, that we need to fasten our minds and our hearts on God. But how do we do that? I can just imagine as David had wept till he had no more strength to weep. He had cried everything out. He was greatly distressed. I bet you he had to think back to what God had done for him in the past. Any of y'all ever get, there's a song in our hymnal that says, count your blessings, name them one by one. Count your blessings, see what God hath done. A lot of times when we get down and out and discouraged, number one, the first thing that we've forgotten is all that God's given us. We're a bunch of people that complain about how bad we have it in America today. We got more food in our pantries and more clothes in our closet than people all over the world. We ought to look on the bright side. Do y'all like people that look on the bright side? That's why I love Brother Sam, our former pastor here. He could always look on the bright side. I love that quality about him. He could always look on the bright side of things. And maybe there's no bright side in your future, but there's a Lord who can just say, let there be light, and there is light. Think about that. There's a Lord in your life who fights for you. And so I believe David probably went back. Let's go to 1 Samuel chapter 17. We mentioned this last week in passing. Here's what we're going to find when we look at the people who were in situations where there was no one to encourage them, but they still found the courage to do what they needed to do. And remember, that's what courage is. Courage is bravery. Courage is the quality that allows you to do what you need to do, even when others aren't doing it or when it's not easy. And so if we're going to see what was it that these men in the Bible, these profiles in courage that we can look at, what was it that they saw that others didn't see? What's going to give you courage in this life is if you understand that your deliverance from whatever situation you may be in is ultimately not found in your ability to do things, but in God's ability to do it for you. From your eternal salvation to your temporal salvation, I'm going to tell you, you can't do it on your own. Y'all understand that? God can open doors where there is no door. God can make a way where there is no way. When Egypt was pursuing and there was a Red Sea in front, God made a way, didn't he? When Abraham was lifting up that knife to slay his son, that God made a way, didn't he? God can make a way for us where there's no way for you. May say, I don't know how my marriage is going to survive this. I don't know how I'm going to get through this day. I don't know how I'm going to get through this situation. I'm going to tell you, there's a God that we can rely on who is able to do it for us. And so in 1 Samuel chapter 17, we have a familiar story where David and this Philistine giant has come out to defy the armies of Israel. And he is, he makes this bargain, I guess you could say, with Israel. You'll send me out one of your warriors and we'll fight. And, we'll see who wins, basically. And it says in verse 11, well, let's read verse 9. It says, if he be, when Saul, he says, choose you somebody out to come fight me. And the giant says, if he be able to fight with me and to kill me, then will I be your servant. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us. And the Philistine said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. And when Saul and all Israel heard those words of the Philistine, they were dismayed. You know what that word means? I wrote this down in my Bible. Disheartened or deprived of courage. The courage just poured out of these men. They were dismayed and they were greatly afraid. So all of Israel, the mightiest men of Israel, are on one side of the valley, and the Philistines are on one side of the valley, and now they are just drained of courage. They are sore afraid. They're greatly afraid. They're dismayed. And just to fast forward through it, David, he's been at home keeping his father's sheep. I think there's 3 of his brothers that are down there fighting, or not fighting. They're cowering towards the giant. His dad sends him with some cheese and some food to go strengthen his brethren. And David, once again, in verse 20, rises up early in the morning, and he left his sheep with a keeper and took and went, and Jesse, and commanded him. And he came to the trench as the host was going forth to fight, and shouted for battle. For Israel and the Philistines had put the battle in array, army against army. And David left his carriage in the hand of the keeper of the carriage and ran into the army and came and saluted his brethren. And as he talked with them, behold, there came up the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, out of the armies of the Philistines, and spake according to the same words, and David heard them. So David herds them this time, and it says, and all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were sore afraid. And David begins to say, you know, what are we doing here? And one of his brothers says unto him, he says, I know your pride. This is verse 28. I know your pride. I know your naughtiness of your heart. You've just come down here that you might see the battle. And David stands up, the only one there, this young keeper of the sheep who nobody thought had anything in them. He stands up and he says, what have I now done? Is there not a cause? I'm going to tell you, this one little boy, I don't know how old he was here. Let's say he's a teenager. I don't know how old he was, to be quite honest with you, but he is the one that stands up and he says, isn't there something that we should be fighting for? And that ought to say something to the youth of this church, that, you know, you can be such an encouragement. I'm looking at Brother Cale. When you came forward to be baptized a few months ago, I'm going to tell you, there could nothing have happened to me the next couple of weeks. I was on cloud nine. Nothing would have bothered me. And that was just one little decision. You know what that started with? The Hall family came down to join this church. Their decision led to Kel's decision, led to my encouragement. We can impact one another, can't we? And a lot of times we think, well, what good is it to try to encourage them? Or what good is it to try to go this morning or try to do this thing or be at this event or say this to somebody? Is there not a cause? That's one of my favorite questions that's ever asked in the Bible. Is there not a cause? There is. The cause of Christ. And so David lobbies that he wants to go and he wants to be the one to fight it. And David said to Saul in verse 32, let no man's heart fail because of him. David's being an encourager, isn't he? He says, your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. And Saul said to David, I want you to notice, this is why they were greatly dismayed. This is why they were greatly afraid. They're dismayed. They're sore afraid. This is what the Bible uses. Saul says to David, thou art not able. Y'all see that? You are not able to go against this Philistine and fight with him, for you're but a youth, and he a man of war from his youth. And I believe that's where all the discouragement, this entire group of warriors who were disheartened, who were deprived of courage, the whole reason is because they had forgotten God's ability. And the truth is that Saul's right. David, you're not able to go fight against this giant. But listen to what David said. David said unto Saul, your servant kept his father's sheep. And there came a lion and a bear and took a lamb out of the flock. And I went after him and smote him and delivered him out of the mouth. And when he arose up against me, I caught him by his beard and smote him and slew him. Thy servant slew both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of them, seeing he hath defied the armies of the living God. David said, moreover, the Lord. See, when your focus gets off the Lord and his ability, that's where discouragement sinks in, right? But here's one that knows how to encourage himself in the Lord. He thinks back to the bear. He thinks back to the lion. Probably when he's sitting there, when he's wept all he can weep and everybody wants to stone him, he goes back and says, think about that lion. Think about that bear. Think about that Philistine. I wasn't able, but there's a God that was able. He says, moreover, the Lord that delivered me out of the paw of the lion, out of the paw of the bear, he will deliver me out of the hand of the Philistine. And Saul said unto David, go, and the Lord be with you. He'd even directed Saul's mind back to the Lord, didn't he? That's what we can do. See, this is the youth of the church. He says, that's what one of the brothers, didn't he say? But you're just a youth. Listen, I don't care if you're old, young, whatever. You can encourage the other people in this church by your faith in God. You know, when Paul was encouraging Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter 2, he says, I know you have real, sincere, unfeigned faith. You don't know what relying on God's ability is. It's faith, isn't it? That's what faith is. And without faith, you can't please God. Without faith, you can't be courageous. Without faith, you can't do what you're supposed to do when it's hard to do what you need to do. You can't do it without faith. And so Paul, the same thing that he's telling Timothy, I know that faith, the faith to do what you need to do is in you. That's what David is discouraged. That's what David is displaying here in his discouragement in 1 Samuel 30, in the discouragement of Saul in 1 Samuel 17. He's saying, guys, use your faith. And I'm going to tell you, whether you're young or old, you display faith. That's contagious, isn't it? It's contagious to be around people that are full of faith. I mentioned being at the church yesterday. It's just good to be around people that love the Lord, have faith in the Lord, like you do here today. This is a reason that we need to be here, encouraging one another, exhorting one another, because I thought my faith grows weak. You remember in Mark chapter 9, the man whose son was sick, and he said, Lord, I believe, but help my unbelief. See, your faith, your belief can become to wax cold in this life, or you need people to stir you up. That's what I'm trying to do here today. That's what these stories are here. These profiles and courage that we have in the Bible weren't given to us so we could read them to our children before bed, that we could draw strength from these stories. And so he says the God that he's not looking at his own ability. Because if David would have measured it up and said, here's Shaquille O'Neal and here's me. And he's got the weapons of the world. He's got a shield and a spear and a sword, and all I've got is a slingshot and 5 stones. I wouldn't bet on David, would y'all? I don't know what the Vegas odds would be, but David would not be favored in that fight. But David wasn't looking towards the odds of the world. David was looking to his God who was able. You remember, we looked last week at Deuteronomy chapter 1. And it says of the spies that went out, Moses is recounting when the spies went out into the promised land. And it says in verse 28 that our brethren have discouraged our heart. They came back with an evil report and they discouraged the heart of the people. Well, I want to look at Numbers chapter 13 where this actually takes place. This is the first time this story is told for us in the Bible. And it says, and the Lord spake unto Moses in verse 1 of chapter 13, saying, Send thou men, that they may search the land of Canaan, which I give unto the children of Israel, of every tribe of their fathers, shall you send a man, and every one a ruler among them. And Moses, so they're calling out the spies that are going to go into the land which God was going to give them. Now notice what God says. He says, send thou men, that they may search the land of Canaan, which I give unto the children. There was no doubt that God was going to give this land unto the children of Israel. And it says, and Moses, by the commandment of the Lord, sent them from the wilderness of Paran. All those men were heads of the children of Israel. Now, I want you to notice here that we had a young shepherd boy who's going to encourage Israel, but here we have leaders in Israel who are going to discourage Israel. And if you remember last week in Colossians chapter 3, I believe it's verse 21, when Paul writes to fathers that they don't provoke their children to wrath or to anger lest they become discouraged. He's writing to the leader of the home by saying through your actions and through your words, you can crush those who are under your leadership. It's the same thing that's going to happen here. That ought to make me that ought to sober me up a little bit, right? By the way I act, the things I do, the deacons of this church, the mothers in Israel of this church. You know, the church is a place, you can go read Titus chapter 2, a church is a place where the younger are to learn from the older. So we've seen earlier that the older can draw courage and learn from the younger, but that should put a weight of responsibility among us. We're not just coming in here for an hour and 30 minutes on Sunday and thinking that we don't affect others around us. By the things you say, the way you act, the way you handle yourself, you are showing the next generation how it is to do church, what it is to be a church family, what it is to have faith in God. Let that sink in for you today. Every one of those little ones is looking up to you. Think about that. There's somebody there. I've tried to instill that in my children. Somebody's going to be looking up to you. They're going to see what you do or what you don't do. And so the leaders of Israel have gone out to be spies, and they get the clusters of grapes, and they bear it between 2 men on a staff, and they brought the pomegranates and the figs, and the place that was called the brook Eshcol, because the cluster, I'm on verse 24, the cluster of grapes that the children of men cut down from thence, and they returned from searching of the land after 40 days. And so you can imagine, you ever taken somebody to the airport or something and they go on a trip maybe for a week and then you come and pick them back up? What do you want to hear? What was it like? What did you do? Let me see the pictures, right? Well, here, they've been gone for 40 days, and I can just assure you that Israel is gathered together. They want to hear about this land that God is going to give them. And so the spies come out and they say in verse 26, they that went and came to Moses and to Aaron and to all the congregation of the children of Israel unto the wilderness of Paran to Kadesh, and brought back word unto them and unto all the congregation, and showed them the fruit of the land. And they told him and said, we came unto the land whither thou sent us, and surely it flows with milk and honey, and this is the fruit of it. Now I can just imagine that they were ready to go. And I believe if the heads of Israel would have said, let's go today and take it, they'd have gone. But listen, this is the word in verse 28. It says, nevertheless, the people be strong that dwell in the land, and the cities are walled and very great. And moreover, the children of Anak are there. The Amalekites dwell in the land of the south, and the Hittites and the Jebusites and the Amorites dwell in the mountains, and the Canaanites dwell by the sea and by the coast of Jordan. And I know what happened here is everybody became anxious. Everybody became scared. They began to murmur probably. They began to voice their displeasure towards Moses, towards Aaron, towards the leaders that spied. And Caleb stands up, and it says Caleb stilled the people before Moses. That literally means he hushed them. He said, hush, y'all, I got something to say. And he said, let us go up at once and possess it, for we are able. Do y'all see that? We are able to overcome it. But the men that went up with him said, we be not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we. And here's the truth. You know what? The spies were right. Think about that. In their own strength, they were not able. But you fast forward to chapter 14, verse 8, Caleb once again says, it says in Joshua, this is verse 6, and Joshua the son of Nun and Caleb the son of Jephunneh, which were of them that searched the land, rent their clothes, and they spake unto all the company of the children of Israel, saying, the land which we passed through to search it is an exceeding good land. If the Lord delight in us, then he will bring us into this land and give it us, a land which flows with milk and honey. Only rebel not against the Lord, neither fear ye the people of the land, for they are bread for us. Their defense is departed from them, and the Lord is with us. Fear them not. How many of y'all have suffered discouragement because you forgot that the Lord is with you? The Lord is on your side. Now, we've seen David and Goliath. We've seen David and the children of Israel. We see now Joshua and Caleb. Let's look at one more. In the book of Daniel. Y'all are all familiar with this story, I hope. The king of Babylon, they've conquered Israel. They've brought in the best and the brightest, and they've changed their diet. They've changed their names. They're trying to change the way they worship. And Nebuchadnezzar, the king, makes an image. This is chapter 3 of gold. And he makes this pronouncement. That when you hear all the music, you need to fall down and you need to worship this golden image that he has set up. And it says in verse 6 of chapter 3, and whoso falls not down nor worships that same hour, he'll be cast in the midst of a burning fiery furnace. Therefore, at that time, when all the people heard the sound of the cornet, the flute, the harp, the sackbut, the psaltery, and all kinds of music, it says all the people, the nations and the languages fell down and worshiped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And what Nebuchadnezzar here is doing, and the forces of Babylon are doing, they are using two of the most powerful weapons to discourage you, and what the world will use to try to mold you into their image. They're using persecution and they're using peer pressure. They're saying, if you don't do it, this is going to happen to you. And then when the music starts playing, it says all the people, all the nations bowed down to worship this idol. But one important lesson in Bible study is that sometimes the word all doesn't mean all without exception. It means all of some types, because there was at least 3 that didn't bow down. Don't y'all want to be those kind of people? At least those 3 that don't bow down. And so Nebuchadnezzar goes, we'll fast forward through this just a moment. He brings them back out. He knew Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He didn't want them to die. He says, I'm going to give you one more chance. When you hear it, you fall down. And he says this. He says, if you do it, it'll be well with you. This is verse 15. But if you worship not this idol that I've set up, you shall be cast the same hour into the midst of the burning, fiery furnace. And who is that God that shall deliver you out of my hands? Verse 16, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we are not careful to answer thee in this matter. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able. What was the fact? What did they have in mind that gave them the courage to stand up to this king in the face of persecution, in the face of everyone else falling down? What was the one thing they kept in mind to encourage their hearts? It was that God was able. Do y'all see that? Our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of thy hand, O king. Think of our God is able. Do y'all ever think about the ability of God? The God who can do. Nebuchadnezzar would later say that he does his will among the army of heaven and the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand or say unto him, what doest thou? I don't know what's discouraging you today. I don't know what's bringing you down, but I know this. There's a God that can overrule it, that can change it, that can bring good out of it, that can do whatever he wants to do. Follow him. Trust in him. It'll get you through. What got David through? It was knowing that God was able. What got these boys through? It was knowing that God was able. What was it that gave Joshua and Caleb the courage to say, I know there are giants. I know there are walled cities. I know there are armies that have more weapons than we have and more skill than we have. But there's a God who's on our side that's able. That's able. Listen to what the Bible says about God's ability. He says in one part in Luke chapter 3 and verse 6, it says that God is able of these stones to raise up children unto Abraham. In Hebrews chapter 2, beginning in verse 17, it says, wherefore in all things it behooved him to be made like unto his brethren, that he might be a merciful and faithful high priest in things pertaining to God, to make reconciliation for the sins of his people. For in that he himself, this is speaking of our God, he himself has suffered being tempted. He is able to succor them that are tempted. You know what that means? God has the ability to relieve you, to bring you aid, to bring you comfort, to bring you strength when you have no strength. God has been where you've been. He's defeated the enemies you couldn't defeat, and he lives and reigns for you today to help you. Think about that. I don't know what you're going through at school, at work, in your family, but there's a God who's able to bring you through it. In Jude 1 and 24, it says, now unto him that is able to keep you from falling and to present you faultless before the presence of his glory and exceeding joy. You say, how am I going to not fall back into that sin that often tempts me? How am I not going to fall into this habit or that habit? There's a God who's able to keep you from falling. 2 Corinthians 9 verse 8, it says, and God is able to make all grace abound towards you, that you always, having all sufficiency in all things, may abound to every good work. How am I going to do the good works that God's called me to do? There's a God that's able to give you the grace to do it. I love this one. Hebrews chapter 7, beginning in verse 24, it says, but this man, speaking of Jesus, because he continueth forever, hath an unchangeable priesthood, wherefore he is able also to save them to the uttermost that come unto God by him, seeing he ever lives to make intercession for them. I want to tell you about a God that's able to save them to the uttermost. Don't y'all love to hear about a God that's able to save people that man couldn't get to? That's able to save those that never heard the gospel, that never heard of Jesus, that never heard the blood of Christ. But there's a God that's able to save people to the uttermost. He can save the unborn. He can save the mentally incapacitated. He can save sinners like me. We're the uttermost. Y'all know that, right? We're the ones that needed a physician. We're the ones that were not whole, but God's able to save them to the uttermost. In Ephesians chapter 3 and verse 20, it says, now unto him that is able to do exceeding abundantly above all that we could ask or think, according to the power of God that works in us. He is able. Able. Think about that, y'all. He has the ability to do. Do y'all ever pray big prayers? Let me ask you, do y'all ever pray big? I've got 10 of them I go through my prayer list every day that are my exceeding abundant prayers. I got one I pray every day. I want y'all to start praying this. Listen, I'm asking you, please. I pray every day that next time we have, not the next time, but it'd be fine the next time, but we have a meeting. We got to go get chairs downstairs, and we got to use that. We have Brother Wayne over there directing traffic in the overflow lot. That's one of my prayers. You know, God could do it. There's no reason this church house couldn't be packed with people. God could do it. I prayed and prayed and prayed and prayed and prayed for years for that we'd have new young families come into this church. And, you know, we had a few that would come for a few times and they'd leave. Y'all remember some of those? And it just was heartbreaking. And I continued to pray. And then I became the pastor of this church. And it was a lot easier to pray that when it was on Brother Sam to do some of the teaching. But I kept praying. Y'all know, is it Staples that has the easy button? It is, isn't it? I think God's got an easy button. He sent the Coopers and the Hall. I'd never heard of these families. He just sends them to our church. You didn't have to work with them. I know that one day God won't hit the easy button for me. I'll have to do some hard evangelism. But God can do exceedingly above all that we can ask or think. They've brought me so much happiness and courage. We've had Abby, we've had Kale come forward. That just brought me, it's just the easy button. God can hit, you know what? You think, there's no way my marriage or my health or whatever. And listen, it's not always going to be easy, but there's a God that can just hit the easy button and make a way